So welcome to the Psychedelic Mom podcast today, and I am so excited. I have Alexander Beiner here today, and I am a huge fan of you, Alex. I watched Rebel Wisdom religiously, and so Alexander is a writer, podcaster, and you designed and facilitated groups around the world for transformational work. You were the co-creator and co-facilitator of Regenerative Stewardship, which is a psilocybin retreat focusing on leadership and self-development. And you've been covered in GQ and Guardian, and you're a writer whose writings have been seen in Medium in many places. You were the co-executor and director of Breaking Conventions in Europe, which is the largest science and cultural science, you are the co-executive director of Breaking Conventions, which is Europe's largest psychedelic conference covering basically science and culture. And you were the co-producer and co-host of Rebel Wisdom. And Rebel Wisdom for me was a place where I could just land in a world where I couldn't make sense of anything going on. So you were covering such topics as sense-making, the dark web, the deep web, tribalism, spiral dynamics. So you were taking kind of the wisdom traditions and these ideas of sense-making and spiral dynamics to try to make sense of the narratives that were in the world, this kind of war that we were in. And now you've written this amazing book and gone on this adventure within your own psychedelic experience called The Bigger Picture. So when I was researching you and kind of looking at all these things that you were doing, and basically you've been really trying to help us all with the bigger picture and really making sense of what's going on in the world. And it sounds like in some ways that was what this bigger picture project is all about. So you've been helping me make sense of things, and I'd love to jump in first with where you are in the world today and this new adventure of this book that you've written.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here, and thank you for the very kind introduction. So, well, where I am physically in the world is in southeast London in the UK. I'm actually half German and half Irish, but I've lived here in the UK for quite a while, kind of 13 years or so. And yeah, where I am in terms of my life is, about almost a month away from the publication of my first book, The Bigger Picture. So yeah, and like you said in the introduction just now, it really is an attempt to bring together a lot of different ideas, certainly, but a lot of different worlds. And in particular, through Rebel Wisdom, one of the things we were really exploring was, firstly, how do we make sense of what's going on in a really complex, challenging, constantly changing world? And once we can make sense, how do we take meaningful action to create the kind of world that collectively we might want to create? So those are really big questions that no one has the answer to. But I have always been pretty convinced that psychedelics are a very powerful tool in helping us to do that. So the bigger picture is really bringing together a lot of the ideas I was exploring through Rebel Wisdom, sense making, systems change, what it really means to be in a complex system, with those very deep, personal, meaningful experiences we have on psychedelics, and seeing, how can that psychedelic experience really be applied to making sense of the world we're in, and how can what we're learning from psychedelic science and philosophy really be applied directly to finding a way through what I call in the book the big crisis, which is all the many overlapping challenges we face collectively, from climate change to nuclear proliferation to political polarization, our inability to agree on pretty much anything. Somehow we, collectively need to find ways to get better at that. And I think psychedelics, if used correctly, which is a really important part of it, if used correctly, can be a really important contribution to that effort.
Yeah. So what was, prior to writing this book and doing this research with Imperial College of London, is that where
Yeah.
was? What was your psychedelic experiences leading up to this book?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. There were many of them, certainly. So I think, so I had my first psychedelic experience when I was 18, and it was kind of recreational, just with some friends. But for me, there was an immediate sense of that it was an important experience, and I felt very, it felt kind of weirdly familiar, and I felt very comfortable in that state. So I then got really fascinated by the philosophy and academia around that. And so this was in like 2005, 2006. So it was a really different landscape to what psychedelics are like now. And a lot of what was going on was internet forums like Erowid, or the one I was involved with was called the Grow Report. And that was amazing because I got really immersed in the philosophy around psychedelics. That was really something that I really connected with a lot. And the idea of how could psychedelics be almost like revolutionary tools in culture, which of course was an idea that was around in the 60s and beyond, and then became unpopular as psychedelics became more medicalized, and I completely understand why. So during that time, so for me, my psychedelic experiences were, I always treated them with quite a lot of caution. So I would maybe have maybe like 4 or 5 experiences a year, usually out in nature with some close friends. But they were absolutely such an important and profound part of my own personal and spiritual journey. Also led me to practicing meditation. I had a daily meditation practice, not really anymore, but I was very into mindfulness and Zen meditation. And so, yeah, and then for a while I sort of stepped out of the more philosophical side of things, and psychedelics just kind of continued to be something that was very much a part of my personal growth. And it became, very much focused around, and still is in a lot of ways, really understanding myself better, trying to be a better everything partner, husband, brother, trying to really do the kind of gritty, not so metaphysical, sparkly work of, which often is accompanied by like embarrassment. I have an experience of like, oh my God, oh God, I can't believe I'm doing that. Which is where a lot of the growth, I think, comes from in the experiences. Not the only place, but definitely a big part of it for me. So before the trial, which was I was a participant in a trial at Imperial College London, investigating the effects of intravenous DMT, continuously pumped for 30 minutes, but the experience was about 40 minutes or so. So before then, I had a lot of experience with psilocybin and ayahuasca in particular. So I was kind of, and all of us, I guess, on that trial, because we were the dose finding trial. So we were like,
so you were almost like the pre-trial.
Yeah, we were like the guinea pigs for the guinea pigs. Whatever guinea pigs use as guinea pigs, that's what we were. And so we were all of us fairly seasoned psychonauts.
And a third dropped out, is that right?
Oh, well, no, there were 11. As far as I know, there were 11 of us originally, and then there were either 8 or 9 of us by the end. So 3 or 4 people dropped out. I think partly due to the intensity. It could have also been some people dropped out because of personal reasons or whatever it might be. But it was a very, very intense experience. So, yeah.
So when you got invited to do this and were thinking about it, I love how your book talks about your why. And it seems like that why is very tied to even your work with Rebel Wisdom, besides your own personal growth. And that, like you just talked about, the gritty work of doing the deep shadow work and really understanding how we construct egos and the whole cultural narratives, how they really affect all of us. And but it sounded like the bigger picture was also important to you, of what you just talked about, going in and using these psychedelics to maybe have a deeper understanding of, or some solutions even, for the culture and all that's going on in our world today. Is that so?
Very much so. Yeah, definitely. I kind of explicitly, so part of it was just pure adventure seeking curiosity. Like, wow,
You are brave.
It's like, I couldn't believe that.
Oh my God.
And I remember, because I'm friends with Chris Timmerman, who was running the study, and also friends with Lisa Luan, who was doing, she's a PhD student who's doing a lot of the day-to-day. And so it was kind of informal, where they kind of, Chris mentioned it, and I was like, yeah, I'm up for it, definitely. And then I remember, like, I don't know, a couple of minutes later, I thought, I don't know, this is a good idea. This is kind of crazy. But I was fascinated that just by the whole thing, and that they were even doing it in the first place. So, yeah. And then as it sort of approached and got closer, I started thinking, well, I mean, this is an amazing opportunity for all of us to kind of test the idea that you can receive information from a certainly different state, maybe from entities, or certainly from a kind of a different, what seems to be a different dimension or universe, right? So it's kind of a wild idea, but I was trying to stay open and agnostic to that, because I do think there's something in it. And I think we have, Terence McKenna used to say that we have an absence of good medium-sized practical ideas. There's like what we need is this engagement and imagination and hope to find our way through the times we're living in. And I thought, well, let's give it a shot. If we can all sort of be quite experimental with this, be interesting to see what we come out with. However, also, what I learned was that, or the place I came to is that there isn't really the divide between the personal, gritty kind of shadow work and the metaphysical exploration. They're related and interrelated and interconnected. So that was a big lesson for me throughout the whole experience, which was which was really profound, because I was kind of hoping to not have to go into my stuff too much.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I read how there was one kind of common theme, was that fear right before you were getting the injections. And when I first was reading about your book, I thought it was actually 5-MeO-DMT, but it's DMT that you were doing, which is a completely different experience. And like you were just talking about, for someone who's never done DMT, it really can take you into, well, why don't you speak about it? Because you have way more experience now than I do. What kind of realms were you entering?
Yeah, and they are very different. And actually, I haven't really properly done 5-MeO, but I'm going to do so soon. And Imperial are doing a 5-MeO study, which I'm going to be involved in.
I'll sign up for that one.
Yeah. I'll let you, they're always looking for people. So so 5-MeO people report much more a sense of sort of a non-dual oneness.
Exactly.
NN-DMT is really different in the sense that it's an experience where you keep your agency, so your sense of you and your sense of kind of you interacting with the dimension or the realm you're in. It's very much intact. And actually, Rick Strassman, who did the first sort of study on DMT, or after psychedelics had been made illegal, he did almost the first study of the psychedelic renaissance, really, in the really early 90s.
Spirit molecule.
Yeah, the spirit molecule. So he and a lot of the participants, not all, but a lot of them were Buddhist, or perhaps are Buddhist. And they were expecting that kind of 5-MeO style dissolve into everything kind of experience. And what they got was something really, really different, which was a whole lot of something, right? Instead of nothingness, it's like there's entities, there's color, there's intensity, there's different realms, there's different sensations, and all the while, you as you are still there, and you're kind of interacting in the same way that, like we're interacting right now. So Strassman wrote another book after that, and he argued that a better way to make sense of that NN-DMT experience is through the kind of mystical experience reported in the Bible, where it's a prophetic experience. So, for example, Moses talking to the burning bush, like he's not dissolving into the whole universe and receiving information like that. He's Moses. The voice of God is like speaking to him. He's receiving instruction and then going and enacting that in the world. The DMT experience is much more like that. So even in the most profound moments of it, there is still the sense of my individuality, which is its own type of mystical experience as well. So it's but an important distinction, definitely. Yeah.
So what was, in your experience, something that you encountered that you'd be willing to share that was like Moses speaking to the burning bush moment? Did you have any of those moments?
Yes, in a sense, perhaps not that like grandiose or big, but I don't want to compare myself to Moses, but yeah, in a really different way, like, and maybe a good example of it. I mean, I had lots of entity encounters, some of which are in the book, because in the bigger picture, I use those dosings as a kind of a narrative thread to pull out themes that are more universal about what's going on. And yeah, in my final dosing, which was the strongest one, I found myself in this very like huge, intensely populated, almost like a rainforest of entities, and kind of, but very galactic feeling, and kind of very vast. And I had one entity encounter with some really friendly, sort of like hyperdimensional chinchillas. And that was, but we couldn't understand each other, and it was intensely weird but fascinating. And after that, I noticed this other entity, which looked really different and felt very different. It was more like reserved. It looked more like a squid. It was darker, and it was moving more slowly. And I had this thought that, that's like a different species in an ecological niche, and this is an ecosystem. And as soon as I had that thought, so I often have, on pretty much all psychedelics, the experience of like a teaching presence, like a dialogue with some higher power, my higher self, or the medicine, or whatever it might be. I'm not quite sure. It's something, some people have that, other people don't. But I had that. So immediately the teaching presence that was often like my guide was like, yes, that's exactly right. These entities are different. They occupy different niches, and humans do too. And then I had this glimpse of this like huge ecosystem of intelligences. And that was for me, that was a real mystical experience, because I felt really like awed and humbled. But interestingly, I felt tiny, but not insignificant, and I also felt just bowled over by like the vastness of what I was seeing. And that experience is very much like the overview effect that astronauts talk about when they see the Earth from space. And it really fascinated me, and it really stuck with me, because in that experience, you can be like really individual and be really connected to your ego and connected to who you are, distinct from everything else, but be completely connected to something much greater than yourself. And I thought, like, for me, it really stuck with me as, really profoundly for me personally, but then also as a thought of like, that mystical experience is a really good one for people in the West, because we're hyper individual, and trying to have that trying to integrate that nothingness experience into our day-to-day life is very difficult. And I find people get really tangled, all of us get really tangled with trying to make sense of non-duality in a really dualistic, individualist world. And that experience for me was personally really useful, because I was like, hey, well, my ego and my self can be really big while at the same time being really tiny in comparison to how big everything else is. And it's also useful, but scientifically that is the case. We're like one person, tiny person on this massive, tiny planet in this vast universe. So that was really meaningful. Yeah.
Wow. Really profound. Yeah. all the little organisms that we can't even see that are part of our bodies, right? And the
Exactly.
intelligence that they have. When you were there with these entities, you just spoke about non-duality. Was there also a sense of this oneness with them, that there was still this not dissolve into nothingness, but that there was something that connected all these entities with you?
That's a really interesting question. Like, in the kind of yes and no, if I feel into it. Like, they felt so alien, like so alien to me, that there was a real sense of them being other, but there was a sense of the entire experience having a kind of cohesiveness and unity to it. So it was kind of both. But I would say that, like, there were some, I mean, this is a really kind of something that really I wrestled with a lot and was really curious about. Some of the entity encounters I had, I could look at in like Jungian or symbolic terms and be like, okay, that's this part of my personality structure or shadow that's being manifest, and this is me integrating it and dealing with it in that way. But others were totally alien. And I was like, I don't think that the space chinchillas, they just didn't feel like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just
Right.
like so different. But, excuse me, they didn't feel like a kind of, I don't know, like symbolic representation of some
That's
shadow
something
material. It
internal,
felt like totally
right.
different. Sometimes an entity was both. It was both its own thing and something that was like internal in me, which is
Wow.
kind of a paradox, but yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. One of the things you said in the book was that psychedelics teach us a language, and it's kind of a dangerous language. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, yes. So I think there's a kind of logic and like syntax to navigating a psychedelic experience. It's full of, it's like a language of symbols and feeling and sort of hidden meaning. And I think a lot of people, when you navigate a psychedelic experience enough times, you start to get kind of a sense of like, okay, this is how to do this, in the same way that if you're windsurfing, you kind of get the gist of like how to do that. And it's dangerous because there is always the risk with psychedelics that you might go mad. Really, I think that's partly why they're kind of like, in a way, spiritual skydiving.
Yeah.
Completely
It can be
profound.
untethering.
Yeah, massively, and people we can all get really ungrounded and get lost in meaning making that takes us actually further into blindness rather than opening our perspective to more. So they have that quality to them. And so it's kind of like surfing a really profound but really kind of dangerous wave every time you take a psychedelic.
Were you afraid of that at all? I mean, anybody that's had some of these bigger psychedelic experiences, I can think of like certain experiences that took me a while to integrate. So I can imagine myself going into this experience and thinking like, oh, I want to do this. And then another part of me being like, whoa, I hope I don't come back untethered. Did you have any moments of questioning how tethered you were and grounded you were during this process?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm always somewhat afraid when I take a psychedelic, right? I think it's kind of healthy that we still be connected to that fear or caution as well. But yeah, fear. Yeah, interestingly, I was rarely afraid. Well, there were moments during the dosings that I had a lot of anxiety. Also, just like body anxiety when they pump it in for the first few minutes, like all of our heart rates shot up for a few minutes and then leveled off. So we kind of, and the team at Imperial are kind of interpreting that as like we became like, I guess, like state competent, like we kind of settled into the experience, which was definitely my experience, But actually the most intense was between dosings, because I had really, really crazy synchronicities that were inexplicable based on like my model of reality, including seeing, thinking I recognized like a really an acquaintance, someone I don't know that well, on the street, going over to be like, hey, what are you doing here? And then it wasn't them, but that person had passed away like 2 days before that. And I was like,
Whoa.
bizarre coincidence,
Right.
right? Really strange stuff. And so I try with that to just kind of stay agnostic and just kind of not jump to any meaning making, which I think is kind of served me pretty well so far. But it really shook me. All of that, like that was like a week of lots of, 3 or 4 things. That was probably the most intense, but there were a few other things that were bizarre.
Yeah.
Apologies,
And just holding that and staying in the mystery.
Yes, staying open. But to be honest, I was so shaken emotionally.
I bet.
I was like,
Right.
how do I make sense of this? This is totally bizarre. That was scarier than pretty much anything that happened in the dosings.
I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Because now you're back in kind of the real world. This is the reality, or the reality that we're used to living in.
Yeah.
And something like that happens, and it's like, whoa, what is happening? Have I been changed? What's going on? But then the synchronicity is so strange.
Very, very. And yeah, and I spoke to a few people during it, which was helpful. And, Tim Reed, who's a kind of psychedelic psychiatrist, and Bernardo Kastrup, I spoke to after, who's Kastrup is actually a computer scientist and a philosopher. He's got 2 PhDs, but he's an idealist. So the idea that the universe is fundamentally mental, it's conscious.
Yeah.
And his take on it was super useful. I was like,
Interesting.
And part of it was that, the thing that really landed with me, by this time it was like months later. So I had kind of a week of being like kind of highly connected in that way, but I'm also like quite scared of that state. So I kind of ground a lot. But he had this idea of like, that synchronicity is the baseline reality and causality is the sort of appearance of no synchronicity.
Right.
And that makes a lot of sense if you think of everything being interconnected. That's not such a leap to think of it like that. And that was a really helpful thought, because I thought, yeah, in that sense, I'm seeing past the causality. It's still really weird. I still don't know quite how to make sense of it, but it helped a bit. Yeah.
Wow. And how was your partner while you were going through all this? You're married, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
My wife, Ashley.
Was she nervous?
Beiner. Well, she's a psychedelic researcher and a trainee clinical psychologist. She'll be qualified very soon. So she was very supportive and a great person to have there, because she knows all about psychedelics and all about psychology. Was she nervous? No, she was good actually. She would drive me to the dosings, and it was really nice to have, just to have her and pick me up as well. So
I bet
that sort of grounding element of
back.
it. Yeah, that was really good.
And the fact that she had languaging around it and her own experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine doing that without that. So one of the things that, again, going into this experiment, the desire to kind of have some deeper understandings of this reality and some of the crises that we have going on. You talk in the book about the war on cancer, the war on drugs, the war on everything, that if we keep applying the same reductionist and ways of being, that we are never really going to see great change. And I remember one of the Rebel Wisdom interviews that you did with Daniel. I always say his last name wrong. You can help me out. Schmachtenberger.
Yeah.
I think at one point he said, do we even have the level of consciousness needed for the complexity of the problems that we have of this time? Like, have we evolved enough to even know how to move through the minefields that we're currently in? What did you find through this experiment? Was there anything that you felt like, I can bring that back? That's something that really does apply to this reality. And it's a new way of thinking, and it's a bigger lens.
Yeah, there were quite a few things. One of the really important ones is, speaking to the point you just raised, the difference between being in a complex reality and a complicated reality. This is something Daniel Schmachtenberger has spoken to a lot, really well, and something I talk about in the book, because I think psychedelics give us a lived experience of navigating complexity, being able to hold multiple different ideas at the same time, a huge amount of kind of swirling information that we're kind of feeling all at once and navigating, and still being able to move forward and do something and find meaning and connection. So that, a lot of people in the worlds of systems change and asking this question of what are we going to do? How do we fix our broken systems? They point to the difference between complicated and complex. So if something's complicated, it's got lots of different moving parts. But it's a closed system, so they just interact with each other, like a grandfather clock or a car engine. They're complicated. And if something goes wrong, you just find what went wrong and you fix it, and then the whole thing will work again. And so often our solutions to social and political and economic problems are confused because we think they're complicated problems, but they're actually complex. And complex systems they're sometimes called complex adaptive systems. And they're like living things. Like even a city is a complex system. So it's more than the sum of its parts, and it kind of has a life of its own. Like an ant colony. The interaction of all the individual ants creates an intelligence, which is like a single intelligence, which has a mind of its own. And we live in that. Like human beings are complex systems. Even all relationships are really complex systems, right? Where complex systems are affected by the outside influence, and they adapt and they change as well. So when we're trying to figure out, like, how do we tackle complex problems, if we're doing it from a mindset, like an old mindset of that's focuses on what's complicated, we're just lost already, because like the problem we're trying to solve is changing as we're trying to solve it. So we need to, in my view, embody an attitude and a way of being which is really flexible, really fluid, really curious and discerning, and able to take on a huge amount of information. And the psychedelic experience is that. That is literally what you're experiencing. There's so much going on, and you see very often the way that systems around you are connected. So if you are in a forest, you might get an insight into, oh my God, that tree is interacting with that tree in a particular way. You might not fully understand it, but you would have an intuition. And a lot of interesting inventions have supposedly been inspired by psychedelic experiences and seeing connections that you didn't notice before. That same quality, just to add, of seeing connections where you didn't notice them before is also one of the downsides of psychedelics, because you can also go down rabbit holes of delusion and confusion that narrow your frame of reference. So what I'm arguing in the book is that really, if we can hold more perspectives, have a more complex view of the world, that serves us much better than boiling everything down into an ism or a conspiracy theory or whatever it might be, because then we have this narrow view that doesn't meet the complexity, the genuine complexity of the world.
We can even see that within the psychedelic renaissance, really. Even when we look at kind of this idea of psychedelic therapy, our Western model of using psychedelics, where we take the individual and put them in the room with two clinicians, the heteronormative father and mother figure. I don't know if they're still doing that, putting headphones on, a mask on, and then taking that individual, having them have a profound experience, which I think does work, actually. I think there's so much healing that takes place in that. So and then putting them back into the broken system where, again, it's a little bit of a reductionist model for psychedelics. So it's interesting that even within the psychedelic space, we're being called to have more of an adaptive, curious way of being and being able to hold so much more than what we're really traditionally trained to do in our Western schools.
Absolutely. Such a good point. And that's such a good example because, so much of the focus around the psychedelic renaissance has been we have this mental health crisis that we need to solve by finding new drugs. Right. So it's a complicated attitude, right? It's like there's a problem, and the problem is that we don't have the right medicines, so we'll get the right medicines and we'll fix it. That's also kind of similar to what we thought with antidepressants and SSRIs.
This is how I see it at the moment, but again, I'm expanding, and I have different perspectives. But one is that in some ways, we are imposing the Western model on the earth medicine, psychedelic, entheogen space in a way that is definitely helpful and in a way that is reductionist and potentially really narrow, taking out the animus and the mystical and some of those other aspects. And even in the, losing some of the indigenous voices and the feminine wisdom. And so it is complex. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely agree with that. Yeah, it is. And it's, it's interesting. That's actually partly was one of the threads I was following that influenced the book a lot was I just got really frustrated with psychedelic pharma companies using, we have a mental health crisis and we need to get medicines fast as a justification for, overbroad patents and, kind of quite unethical behavior. And it speaks to exactly that. It's very reductionist, and it doesn't really acknowledge that the mental health crisis is downstream of many other issues like economic inequality, racism, millions of different things, right? And instead, what happens, just like with climate change, it's like, okay, well, recycle. Like, you need to fly less.
Don't use straws.
Don't use straws. Yeah, exactly. And it's I don't see it as kind of a intentional conspiracy other than it's an aspect of the system. Because really, like I said before, like complex adaptive systems, they also adapt to protect themselves. And so if you threaten them with something like mindfulness or psychedelics that challenges the underlying sort of values of it, what it does really well, or identity, like when you start questioning like economic inequality and you have a critique about capitalism and power, it will adapt those and it will corporatize them and then sell them back to you. So you get something like Starbucks being the most like progressive company ever, but then when its workers actually want to unionize and get kind of equal power, they crush it, right? And they kind of they shut down stores and they're like, we'll never have a union. And that's really interesting when you can see where the system presents something, but actually when it comes to, like, for example, the mental health crisis, if you were like, okay, well, actually we need to kind of change our economic system. It's not going to fix everything, and there's still, of course, individual aspects, and it's not that it's not one thing or the other. It's not just systemic or just individual. It's an interaction of both, by definition, for a complex system. But if we can't have the conversation about the wider issues, then we just get stuck in the same, trying to find a quick fix for the symptoms rather than addressing the underlying problems.
Well, interesting. When you were just speaking, it reminded me of the ego, right? When you do go into a psychedelic experience and suddenly, like, your ego is being challenged. And suddenly, protector parts can show up, and just noticing it's kind of the same system that you're talking about.
That's such a good point. Yes, I think it's exactly the same. And it's also really, really smart at being a shapeshifter, the ego. So as soon as this is what happens to all of us, is basically like, oh, okay, we're going to be spiritual now. Okay, well then I'll have a spiritual ego. And it's like,
I'll have
wait
a spiritual
a minute.
Identity.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's almost
very tricky.
It's very tricky. And it's almost in a way, like it's kind of beautiful, I think, because it's adapted to be individual, right? And to kind of, and to stay in its box and keep you in a box. And so I think for me, it's not so much about like getting rid of the ego, but it's about that the ego is the focus of what we're trying to transform, right? And so like from that higher level awareness, we can transform the ego, but it does it sort of kicking and screaming and, like twisting and turning. It's I find it fascinating now. It's,
yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how has this experiment transformed you personally and some of the work that you now want to do?
Wow. That's a really interesting question. No one's asked me that. I have to think about that for a moment. Well, one thing it's done is sort of change my conception of what transformation means. I think before the experience, and particularly before that really powerful last dosing and being in the kind of the overview effect, I think in some ways I was kind of yo-yoing between change the individual or change the system, and trying to figure out which of those I wanted to focus my attention on. I mean, my skill set is really much more on creating sort of transformative experiences for people that they can then use to change or grow. So I'm more individual focused, and a lot of my practices like meditation or journaling or inquiry are very sort of like individual or relational, but not systems level. And that the systems level side of things felt like, obviously something I'm fascinated by, but, a little bit more mysterious, and like, how do you, well, no one quite knows, how do you change a whole system, right? But there's different ideas. But after the experience, I started to, and I guess this is an ongoing process, but I've started to see it more as like profoundly interconnected to the point where you can't separate the two. Right. So not seeing a kind of yo-yo effect. And I guess that's just a general lesson I've learned from this experience and others, is that it's not an either or, but a yes and. And so that relates a little bit to the experience I had where I was like, okay, there's either my own biographical personal stuff, or there's metaphysical entity encounters and spaceships and whatnot, but these are different things. And actually what I learned through the experience was like, these are deeply interconnected in that they're not the same thing, but they are part of the same thing, let's say.
Go into that a little bit more, because I want to understand that, how the individual experience of you and those experiences actually are the same thing.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. So I don't think they're exactly the same thing. But I think where I'm at with it, and this is obviously an ongoing sort of deep philosophical inquiry, like it might be somewhere else in a year's time, but where I'm at with it now is that sort of my personal individual interpretation of a metaphysical truth or reality is never separate from my own glasses that I'm wearing, right? My own view of it. But also, none of us are separate from that greater reality. So there's a really complex, I feel like there's a very complex interplay between being the subject of the experience, perceiving the object, and my own subjectivity changing the object, and the object, like the burning bush or whatever it might be, or the DMT speaking to me, is also changing me. So we're in this kind of what cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls like a kind of reciprocal opening, like this kind of, we're participating. It's like, and you could have it going into nature. You might have a deep spiritual experience because you're in this deep participation with the environment. You're not looking at it like you're watching a TV. You're like in the forest and you're feeling it, and it's you're breathing it in, and then you're breathing out, and it's taking your air and going through photosynthesis. So you're part of everything.
Yeah.
But you're still you. And I had in my first dosing an experience where the lesson was if you wanna go to hyperspace, you have to like make sure you have your baggage with you, right? But my bag, so my emotional baggage, it was like your bags are wide open. You haven't dealt with this thing and this thing, so you can't go on a trip if your bags are open. You've got to like at least get your bags processed to a particular level in this case where you're able to have enough connection to yourself that you can kind of make sense of it. It was something like that. Yeah.
Did you feel like the integration of this was harder, or did you feel like doing these, how many?
Four dosings, but 5 experiences because one was a placebo, which was very, boring. Yeah.
So was this also deeply healing, transformational experience for you, basically because your luggage was open and suddenly there was deeper shadow to maybe look at and work to be done? Did that happen in this process?
Yeah, definitely. And in a way, I was hoping it wouldn't, because I felt like I've been doing that work for so long. And it was a real lesson. It was a real humbling lesson
Does
of
it
like,
end?
it never ends. Yeah. But I think where you put your focus can change somewhat. But I don't think the work of growing as a human being ever ends for any of us in that sense. So that was a kind of a humbling lesson as well. It was really profound, I have to say. And also, I was really surprised because I didn't associate DMT with that.
No,
And
I'm
so that
surprised.
yeah, it was like the biggest shocker of the whole thing. And my sense is that the reason we don't is cultural, and it's because the experience is so short normally that we don't have time to go deep. But with ayahuasca, for example, we do, because there's an MAO inhibitor, and then we get to really work with, in my view, with the DMT. That was my experiences. You know, I think I've maybe had 40 or 50 ayahuasca ceremonies, and now the 4 DMT extended state experiences. And I would say qualitatively, they were similar to each other, and the teaching was similar. But the teaching I got on just the pure DMT, and there could be many reasons for this about a different setting, or I'm not in a ceremony, which is a little bit culturally alien to me. But the teaching was so deep and so direct that it was I was kind of astonished. I was like, whoa, that was so
Whoa.
advanced, you know, like, oh my God, I can't believe we just went through all of that stuff in the last 3 minutes in such a concise way. Whereas
What a technology.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I really was blown away by it.
Now, would you be open about saying what some of that was?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's, pretty much all of it's in the book. So I've now, for better or worse, been open about it. But a lot of it was my relationship with intimacy and connection in general. So, you know, there was one particular encounter I had in one of my dosings with this sort of planet-sized spider entity, which was very feminine. And it was fascinating because I started feeling like really macho and masculine in relation to it. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to be seduced by this. And I was kind of like floating in space, like with my arms crossed, like metaphorically at least, but it felt like I had my arms crossed. And then it was doing this kind of incredible display of color and shapes. And then I realized that I'd been like trapped in the web. And I was like, oh my God, I was seduced, like, you know. And then there was this whole experience on that, which was all about my resistance to like merging fully and being fully like merged, particularly like with my wife and with the feminine principle in general. And then there's this amazing moment where I was like, I was really in mistrust, right? And this was like, but I was also like, I don't know if this is my own psychological stuff or an entity, and I don't quite know how to play this, you know? But the mistrust was really interesting because I was like, okay, fine, what's the benefit of like merging with another person? And it just wrote love in like big letters. And I was like, ah, shit, yeah, that's really true. And so it was really, really profound, really powerful. And then I had the teaching presence of the DMT sort of, you know, just being really blunt and being like, if you don't like fully, and it's like, it's not like I don't merge at all, but it's like there's something holding back, right? There's a kind of defense. It's like, if you don't let your walls down, you can be safe in some way, but you'll never fully connect to the world. Like that's the price. The price of it is that you never fully connect. So it's up to you. You can go through life with your walls up, or you can take the courage and let them down. And to be honest, it's still a process I'm working on. You know, it's been like 1.5 years, but yeah.
Did it feel like after that, I'm just curious, first of all, that's so profound. I love that story. Thank you for sharing it. Love right there, right?
Yeah, it was really pretty clear, the message.
Well, actually, before I get to that other question, take love, for example, was that an underlying energy that you felt was like, what was the deepest message in all 4 journeys? Was there a real core? Was love one of them?
Yeah, it definitely was. Like loving, I went on this whole process around intimacy, and that, like, in the second last dosing, which I thought would be the last because it was the last one they told us about, loving and forgiving and connecting to myself was the message. So it was very beautiful, and it was very kind of complete in that way. That's actually not in the book because it just didn't fit, because then I had a very dramatic, really exciting dose after that, and it just, the way the editing worked out, it didn't make it in. But that was in some ways the most profound. It was the most simple, and it's the most personally important to me and my personality structure and my history, right? But love in general, yeah, it was definitely there, because there's something, and this is why I love psychedelics so much. There's like a kind of what Stanislav Grof called the inner healer, the kind of like the healing intelligence. Something loves you or loves us there, whether it's us, whether it's something external, we don't know, but there's a real sense of it really cares that we change and get better and work through our stuff. And that for me is like incredible. I'm like, wow, like that's such a beautiful thing. So that love was definitely present throughout. Yeah.
That's pretty powerful, just that alone, you know?
Yeah.
So when you went through that kind of personal journey on the intimacy and the love, and you say it's been a year, you're integrating it, was part of that process like seeing where that resistance came from, or like your own personal resistance to letting walls down? Was there then that deeper work to do of like the patterns that came out of early conditioning or cultural being a man, how a man's supposed to show up? Is that the work that followed?
Yeah, or like I would say is following in a sense.
Yeah.
Not so much my imprint about masculinity, although that probably does play some role. More so my early life experiences and then even adult experiences as well. And that's the thing about this. If we use psychedelics as personal growth and psychological tools, it's slow going, I find, like that. It's not, there was an email I needed to send after one of the experiences to someone, and I only sent that email yesterday. It was like, I had to go through a lot of stuff. I had to talk about it in therapy. I just was avoidant and just in my own stuff and distracted and, didn't want to do it. And but eventually I think what's powerful about it is that the wisdom of that experience stays in some way. And I know what it's not what I have to do. It's, I know what I can do, let's say. And that's very powerful. So I talk about passive and active integration, where some integration is really active after a psychedelic experience, where it's like, okay, I'm going to start getting up at 6 and doing this because self-care was a big theme, and it relates to this or that or whatever it might be, or I'm going to speak to this person, have that conversation I haven't had. And some integration is passive, where it's really working at a deeper level, much more in the unconscious, and then it can just, in my case, sometimes like resolve, not necessarily, resolve actually, like a year or two later. I just kind of almost, And so I always try and encourage people to remember that, because trying to force something that is really just going to come in its own time is just going to lead to, stress. Whereas there are also things that we need to do to just like pull up our bootstraps and get on with stuff that we've been avoiding, or start taking care of ourselves, or start showing up for someone else in our lives better. And only the individual knows which one of those is sort of active and passive in a way. I think you can kind of tell, because the passive ones feel like, I don't know how to do that. But the active ones, a bit different.
I kind of describe it like this at times. Like, first of all, you have this profound experience with a psychedelic and you're like, wow, that's going to change my life, right? And then you realize the change is slow. And you may have an insight, but that insight, like, let's say the insight is like this one part of yourself that feels resistance to doing something. And then there's the other part that's like, do it. Hurry up and do it. And it almost seems like those two parts are communicating with each other. And, it's, I don't know, in my own experience, it's been having patience for the part that's still feeling resistance, like it's just not there yet. And even asking the part that's like, just do it, to like Be patient. It's like this internal little world going on, the internal family systems.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It's a really nice way to describe it. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I definitely resonate with that experience.
Yeah. So would you do this again?
Well, yeah, I totally would actually.
You would?
I actually wanted some more dosings. That wasn't an option, but I would have done, I think I could have done 2 or 3 more comfortably because they are quite short. That's like
Right.
40-minute experience. So, yeah, but I am doing the DMT, the 5-MeO DMT
You
trial
are?
that they're doing. Yes, it's not extended state, I think. Yeah, I don't think it's extended state. I think it's just 5-MeO.
Really?
Yeah, unless it is. I need to actually, I really should know
I
more.
kind of wonder. I think it's probably extended state because I know that they're doing a bunch of that right now where they're doing it intravenously. I was talking to Dr. Joseph Pasculia. Do you know him?
No,
He was talking about that they were doing some longer
Interesting.
term because that's such a short experience too. And what I've heard from people that have done the longer experience of 5-MeO is pretty profound that you've done 5-MeO.
no, I haven't.
No.
It's just,
Okay.
yeah.
So yeah, it is the dissolve into the non-dual. But the longer you're in it, you're actually seeing, you talked earlier about it's all mind, that kind of hermetic idea that it's all mind. And that you actually begin to see how that mind works. Like that part that you just said, there's something, maybe it's inside, maybe it's outside, that's loving you, and this interconnection between the two.
Interesting.
That in the longer form of 5-MeO, you experience that. But I don't know.
How interesting. Now, I
That
really
sounds
should.
fascinating.
Yeah, I really should know this. And the reason I don't is because I got an email from Imperial saying, "Hey, thanks for signing up to the 5-MeO study," which I don't remember doing, but I'm sure I did. Because they're friends, I'm sure we were like
I love it. I
hanging
love
out, having a beer, and they were like, "Hey, we're doing it." I was like, "Yeah, it sounds good." So I sort
He's
of
on the list.
Yeah, he's on the list. Yeah. So I of course, I'm totally consenting and well up for it, but I need to just check exactly what it is that they're doing because there's a few studies going on. But I definitely would do it again. I'm really glad I did it. It was very special, very powerful. And I am really excited about, I'm excited about the 5-MeO one as well. Just to see what the difference as well and what that brings and what I learned from that. And I'll be fascinated to compare that kind of like where you still have yourself and your agency and your there-ness in the NN-DMT and the 5-MeO experience. And just to see, okay, well, what do I learn from both of those? And which one is really, what's it like for me to be in both of those states, Yeah.
Love.
Yep. Yeah, I'm sure that might come back.
Why it's like such a simple thing, and it's like, did I have to do all that for love?
For love, I know. It's always simple, isn't it? Yeah.
So are you missing Rebel Wisdom?
No.
A lot of
mean,
work.
I'm really proud of what we did, and it had really kind of run its course by the end. So there was a real sense of kind of completion. So actually feeling quite, it's now like 6 or 7 months later. So there was, of course, like a bittersweet element to all of it. But now it's like, I'm like a month away from the book coming out. And there's so many other things I'm focused on that I'm like, it feels like a new phase now. So that's a good feeling.
That's like really exciting that it's coming out. I was thrilled to be able to, I'm almost finished, to have a copy of it. I'm so excited. So are you going to go on book tour and promote the book? Are you going to the MAPS conference in Denver? Is this part of your new role?
I guess so, yes. I will be promoting the book. I don't have like a major tour plan, but I have a launch in London and then I have some online events I'm going to be announcing soon. I'm not going to MAPS because it was also just timing wise, it's right after it comes out. And but I am quite looking forward to that new experience of like promoting a book because I mean, like it's going to be, it's going to be different. And I'm still trying to, like this month before launch, I'm doing a lot of like pre-launch stuff and sending it out to people and etc. And doing podcasts. But I've been waiting so long for it to come out. It's kind of surreal that the date is kind of finally approaching, and it's just over a month away from when we're recording this. So I'm also just
because the other thing too is being in the psychedelic space. what I loved about reading about it, it's also really accessible, like for someone who's
It's
not,
good to hear.
to pick up this book and start to understand more about the psychedelic space, but also your work in Rebel Wisdom comes through and all of it. It's really, really incredible.
Oh, thank you so much.
I think
That's
it's
really
going to be
good to
a
hear that it's
massive hit.
accessible. Thank you. Thank you. I really hope so. Yeah. No, thank you for the feedback because not that many people have read it yet. And accessibility was one of the key things I wanted because that's also in general with not just psychedelics, but all these ideas that I think we need to be talking about collectively. Very often they're in these corners of the internet, which are really dense, full of really super smart people, but really
Totally.
hard to access. And I think a lot of what we were trying to do with Rebel Wisdom is translate that to an intelligent but sort of just regular audience who weren't in those worlds. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. So what is next for you? Is there anything that you'd want to share with the audience that's coming for you? Any retreats or work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, so myself and Natasha Pelgrim, who's a phenomenal facilitator and ceremonial space holder, we work together on, we co-created and co-lead a 5-day psilocybin retreat in the Netherlands called Regenerative Stewardship. And that's really around, it's for, it's not just for leaders by any means, but it was inspired by the idea of what does it take to be a leader in the world we're in right now? And that could be a leader in your family, in your own life, for yourself, in your sports team, in your office, wherever, right? So that's something I'm really proud of. We're doing our third one in the end of July, and have a couple of spaces left at actually the time of recording now. And that's really something I've wanted to do for a really long time, which is combine sort of group work where we actually work with the medicine of connection with each other and what shows up in a group, our projections, our transference, our kind of all of the relational wounds and growth we can get from that. And then the ceremonial aspect of it, of actually sitting with the psilocybin and going on that journey. So those two things are distinct in the process. We have the group work, and then on the ceremony days, it's very much about you're in your own space. But it's been amazing because as it's evolved, we've started describing it as like, okay, we're working with two different types of healing here or experience here. One is, of course, the psilocybin, and one is you guys as a group. And what shows up, the relational, which is
I think the relational
essential.
healing is kind of the place where psychedelics is maybe going next. Is
interesting, yeah.
Especially in the West. We've been doing more the individual, but a lot of the people I've been talking to are really doing that same work, the relational small group, medicine space, deep work, even like new ways of communicating with each other, you know?
Yes, yeah, that's really interesting to hear that, and you're in a really great position to be talking to loads of different people in different parts of the psychedelic world. So that's encouraging to me to hear as well, because it definitely is something that matters to me. And, you know, sometimes it's a case of you teach what you have to learn as well, because as I described, you know, for me, there's this like love connecting with people in a group and like, and creating those, being in those experiences and creating them. And of course, I'm like, you know, for me, intimacy it's this incredibly important aspect that of course can be, I know just how hard it can be because, you know, from my own experience, but it's so transformative when we, we have those
even in my
experiences.
personal work of serving, I work with a colleague as well, and we talked recently about really moving more toward small group versus individual work, because it can be a very isolating path for people to do their individual work and then bye-bye. Not, we keep them on long-term integration-wise, but still not to have community in it.
Definitely. Yeah, it can be really, really helpful. And there's benefits to both, but I think, yeah, it can be really magical to have that kind of, what Betty Eisner called matrix, you know, setting dose and then matrix. It's like kind of the wider world you're going into, but like the connection of the people around you. Yeah.
So one tidbit of advice maybe that you came back with for the world after transversing the DMT worlds?
Oh God, I don't know. I would say if I had to boil it down, it would be something about seeing ourselves as part of something really, really big. like really big. And the deeply grounding and also humbling truth of that, because I think it is just true that we are. You just look into the night sky and you can get that feeling. So I think that would be my main takeaway that I would want to share with others, I think.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for being here today and having this conversation and sharing what it was like to go to different universes and have these experiences with entities. And I definitely want to follow up if you do the 5-MeO DMT journey. I would love that.
That'd be great. I'd love to come back on and talk about that. Yeah. And thanks for all the work you're doing, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.